Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 27th of March 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Vanessa Beeley.
Okay.
A pause, of course.
Yes, of course. We're going to start off with a quick reminder, because if you remember on Monday's programme, we had pointed out that Liam Fox had said this: we either leave the European Union with a deal, or we leave with no deal, which is possible, but I think Parliament makes that unlikely, or we don't leave at all, which I think would produce a democratic as well as a constitutional crisis. Well, we said on Monday that we probably have a constitutional crisis, and I think that is the case. And we were highlighting this letter, which was sent from Tim Barrow, who's the UK's representative to the EU in Brussels. It was sent to Donald Tusk, and it says, "I refer to the draft European Council decision taken in agreement with the United Kingdom, extending the period under Article 50, basically extending the date, so we do not leave on Friday as was originally planned." So the constitutional crisis, I argue, surrounds this particular letter, because that's at the sort of treaty level, if we think about it that way. But here in the UK, we have the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, which, as we pointed out on Monday, says this: that exit day means 29th of March 2019 at 11 p.m. It says 11 p.m. because that's midnight in the rest of the EU. So we have this Act of Parliament in place. Now, it turns out that the statutory instrument was laid before Parliament on Monday in order to change the leave date in this Act. But of course, as of this moment, it hasn't been voted on, so this date still applies in UK law. But yesterday, Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the House of Commons, had this to say.
My honourable friend is right. The Prime Minister agreed a short extension. She agreed it on behalf of the United Kingdom, and as such, in international law, the date of our exit from the EU has now changed irreversibly to April the 12th or to May the 22nd if we have agreed to progress with the withdrawal agreement.
Now, that's a pretty spectacular statement, because what she's saying is that irreversibly this change has been made as a result of royal prerogative being used, a letter being written from Theresa May, her spokesperson, to the European Council. So a letter, not a statute, not an act of Parliament. A letter is sufficient, apparently, to change international law, and that takes precedence over UK domestic law. This is quite a spectacular situation, but it didn't end there, because it was not shortly after that, Baroness Evans of Bowes Park, who is the leader of the House of Lords, said this:
"Whether or not we approve the SI, we will now not be leaving on the 29th of March. As noble lords will know, the Article 50 period has been extended, exit day has already been changed. It is important that domestic law is aligned. Without the SI coming into force, the domestic definition will remain set at the 29th of March, this Friday, and our statute book will not function correctly." So
this is, Brian, this is staggering,
Yeah.
Because what she is saying is that it is irrelevant whether the statutory instrument passes the vote in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, that as a result of Theresa May unilaterally deciding that we will not leave on the 29th of March, but that date will be extended until the 12th of April or the 22nd of May, depending on what Parliament votes on. Unilaterally, she makes this decision using the royal prerogative via a letter, no discussion in Parliament, no agreement at this point, that takes precedence over UK parliamentary statute, and therefore, well, the bottom line here is, Brian, this is what the whole Brexit thing has been about, the issue of sovereignty. Where does sovereignty lie? Does it lie in Britain, or does it lie internationally with the EU?
We're being told here very clearly.
Absolutely, very clearly.
We must align still to fit in with effectively what is being given to us from Brussels. So it's very clear that we're going to use the term government of occupation. This government of occupation is now telling us very clearly that even our constitution doesn't mean anything. They can simply go and have a meeting behind closed doors with Mr. Tusk and ultimately we have to bring our law into line with that.
Well, yes. So I thought we would just have a brief look at what is the situation in Britain with respect to sovereignty. Well, of course, sovereignty comes from the people. The people were there first. We were there before any government was there. We established the government originally. So the sovereignty lies with the people. The people's sovereignty, you might view it this way: the people's sovereignty is represented by members of Parliament in the House of Commons, so they represent the will of the people. That's on one side. On the other side, you have the Crown and Parliament, and this is the royal prerogative. But the royal prerogative is limited because the Queen, who is the sort of office holder, takes an oath at her coronation, which binds her to protect the laws and customs of the people, and she is obliged to permit nothing to be done which is not in line with the Constitution. And then both MPs, our representatives allegedly, and the Crown are there to limit government. And what we have at the moment, I'm arguing, is a situation where government is operating beyond its authority. We've effectively got the divine right of government at the moment. And of course, we fought a civil war over the issue of divine right. And unfortunately for the person concerned, they lost their head. So this has been something which has been a long fought issue in this country over where sovereignty lies and people who are operating outside their authority. But we should also just to end this little bit, remind everybody, of course, the question is, do we actually have a Crown and Parliament in this sitting of Parliament? Because, of course, the Queen was not there wearing her crown when she opened this session of Parliament. And so the question is this session of Parliament legitimate at all? So I am arguing that hashtag March 29th is a hashtag constitutional crisis. Now, one of the things, Brian, that staggered me, of course, is that there wasn't a peep out of anybody in the House of Commons or the House of Lords over those two statements. And so the question is, where was the ERG, the so-called European Research Group led by Jacob Rees-Mogg? Of course, these are the people that are apparently standing in the way of Theresa May's deal. Well, there was a big question mark at the weekend over what their position would be, since they were all called in to Chequers. If you remember, we covered this on Monday's programme. Well, we have been told today on pretty good authority that the ERG is now going to accept Theresa May's deal on the basis, according to Steve Baker, this is what we've been told, that he made this quote, that the alternative is worse. So it looks like whatever deals were being done in Chequers at the weekend has produced some results. Now, I'm going to stress that this is unconfirmed at this time, but the source is reliable. So I have no reason to disbelieve it. And I think really, if anybody wants to challenge Steve Baker on this, it's up to him to deny that this is the case. But it seems that the ERG has capitulated and is now going to accept Theresa May's deal. Now, this doesn't get her quite out of the woods, because the DUP is not in the same position, and whether she can actually get this through, it's clearly going to be extremely tight. And we wait to hear whether she's going to bring this to Parliament tomorrow, for example.
Yeah, perhaps we might just pop his face back on screen, because I wanted to comment with his face on screen that, of course, this was the man who freely admitted in front of that Westminster committee that there was a, quote, political elite who were effectively in power, in control. They did not want to leave the European Union, and they were doing everything in their power to delay and break up. And he ended by saying the problem with this group, this political elite, is they do not want to carry out the will of the people. So what is the government? What is the government at the moment? It's undemocratic. It's prepared to break the law. We've now got a demonstration of that. This is not a constitutional government. It's something else.
Well, let's move on to Syria and welcome Vanessa Bailey to the programme. You're just back from Syria. How are things over there at the moment, Vanessa?
Oh, it depends very much where you are. I mean, the northeast is a major issue. I mean, rather than withdrawing troops, it appears that the US is actually building up troops and equipment there. The situation between the SDF and ISIS, I mean, effectively there has been a history of collaboration and collusion between the two groups. And it appears now that they are effectively, I would say, merging into one group almost. What was interesting is that very recently, a friend of mine, a colleague, went to the northeast with a Swedish journalist, and what he discovered there were the camps that contained the ISIS prisoners from Central Europe are available for interviews, for example, for journalists coming in. There are over, by the way, 300 Western journalists in the northeast of Syria at the moment, which is an extraordinary number, entering by the Iraqi border illegally into the northeast, and there are others waiting at the border. So that gives some indication of that being the hotspot in Syria right now. But what is interesting is that the British, French, and American ISIS operatives are not publicly available. In other words, you have to go through the French, British, and American servicemen there and special services and intelligence in order to interview them. So read into that what you will, but it's an interesting difference between the European former ISIS fighters.
Let me just come back to what you said a second ago. You said that it looks like the SDF and ISIS are merging. Now, a week or two ago, Donald Trump said that ISIS was defeated. He said it again, but actually the British government piped in and supported that view and came out with a statement saying how great it was that ISIS had been defeated. Now, just so that everybody understands, just tell us again who the SDF is and how has it come to be that there's some kind of merger between them and ISIS?
Well, because I think you have to suspend this idea of ISIS being any different to any other proxy for the US coalition on the ground inside Syria. It's no different to Al-Qaeda, except in perhaps the financing and where the weapons are coming from. The SDF, which is probably 80% YPG, Kurdish separatists, which are a relatively small percentage of the overall Kurdish community in these areas, by the way. But as I said, we've had a history of the SDF basically moving out of ISIS's way and vice versa. We know that both groups are armed and equipped by the United States. And so therefore it's no great leap to assume that these SDF camps of captured ISIS fighters, those ISIS fighters are quite possibly then merging into the SDF ranks in order to power multiply the occupying force. I mean, this would be, it's no different to the Contras, it's no different. And I think, what is really important, there is this big labeling campaign for ISIS, but in all seriousness, we should just perceive it as another proxy for the US coalition on the ground. It's no different to any other.
Right. So the question is, how many more times are we going to have to hear that ISIS has been defeated? That's
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is it. It's just like a chess game. I mean, they'll use statement after statement, but the fact is, if ISIS is really genuinely defeated, one, it was not America or the UK that had any hand in that whatsoever. And thirdly, there is effectively a build-up of American troops and equipment and British troops and French troops in that area.
Yeah.
Vanessa, can I just ask what's happening in the southeast of the country where the Americans had a big air base? I can't remember what it was called, but it was down near the border.
Jordan? You mean Al Tanif?
Yes.
Yes. There wasn't an air base there that I'm aware of. There's a big American base in Al Tanif.
Okay.
And actually that's connected to the infamous Rukban refugee camp, which is in fact a Takfiri recruitment and training centre for the US, which is why, of course, they often put a stop on humanitarian aid coming in from Russia and Syria into the Rokban refugee camp, and refugees are trying to leave. I mean, it's the same old story. The refugees are desperately trying to leave because it's effectively been turned into a city that is under the occupation of a number of the armed extremist groups. So Al Tanf is still in existence. And as I say, it's connected to a recruiting and training centre for extremists.
Right. Now, Vanessa, while you were there, you witnessed the results of what appeared to be a chemical attack from the terrorist-held areas. Which community was attacked by this?
It was actually 3 relatively small villages to the west of a Syrian Christian town called Al-Skalbiya, which is where I was actually staying this weekend. The attack happened around 5 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. It came in from Al-Qaeda, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as they're now called, HTS, to the north of those villages. And all of the victims, 34 victims, including 3 children, one of whom was suffering seriously from the effects of whatever gas was used, were brought into Al-Skalbiya hospital at around 10, 11 o'clock at night. I got there around midnight, which is when I took this video and the photos that I took and spoke to the doctors. Basically, this woman, it looks very alarming, and it was alarming. So maybe 8 hours after the actual attack, she'd gone into like a toxic shock. The gas was described as a dense white smoke that stayed very low to the ground. People that were in the environment where the gas or the smoke was gathering were very quickly suffering the symptoms of nausea, being unable to breathe. They had blisters on the skin, their eyes, the corneas were affected. The doctors basically administered saline solution, antibiotics, oxygen, and of course at the scene they were washed down to try and cleanse their bodies of whatever gas was being used. But the extraordinary thing, of course, is 34 people affected. This attack coming in from terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, everyone claiming on the social media at the moment and elsewhere that the so-called rebels have never had access to chemical weapons, and yet we see time and time again these chemical attacks against civilian areas that are, dramatically affecting those involved. And I haven't seen a single media report on it in the West so far.
I suppose there would be some of the people that comment on this type of thing that would say that we've seen photographs and video like this before from other places like Douma, for example, but there's some pretty stark differences in what we've seen there and what we've seen in the likes of Douma. For example, I didn't see any hose pipes and people being washed down. It seemed like there was a more traditional medical performance happening there.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it a performance.
No, okay.
But I understand what you mean. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, if we look at the staged waterboarding of victims, which was actually effectively child abuse in Douma by the White Helmets and by the Jaish al-Islam partisan activists who took part in that production. But if we look here, and I mean, of course, it was chaos. People were being brought in. There was also a high risk of the hospital itself being targeted. So, of course, there was a general feeling, not of panic exactly, but of stress and doctors trying to deal with cases coming in. People, as I say, like this lady going into some form of toxic shock a number of hours after the effects and the attack had taken place. Others were recovering. In fact, the majority were recovering by the time I left the hospital. But stress levels were very high, as most of the civilians said. They had been used to receiving mortar attacks on an almost daily basis, but this was something entirely new for them, and they hadn't expected it. And these are very rural, simple people, and they just can't cope with this level of abuse and brutality that they've received for the last 8 years, basically.
Yes.
And these, by the way, Idlib is receiving millions more UK humanitarian aid.
Yes, indeed, which is all going to so-called rebel organisations and individuals. Does this lead us on to Iraq, Brian?
It certainly does. And this really came to light a couple of days ago. Thank you very much to the person who sent this article through to me. Ex-head of Royal Navy admits he was told UK would invade Iraq alongside the US 9 months before the decision was made. And this is Labour peer Admiral Lord West of Spithead. Admitted he knew months earlier. After finding out about the plans, he put the Royal Marines and others on standby, and he was testifying at the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. That was a couple of days ago. Now, just bear in mind where we started, Mike, you're saying we've got a constitutional crisis, we've got a government that's acting beyond the law. We've got Vanessa talking about UK troops still in Syria, which of course they are. How did they get there? Nobody knows, because decisions were made behind closed doors. And now we're getting an insight into how we went to war against Iraq. Were there any proper safeguards put in place? Well, let's follow this through with Alan West. He said, I was told as Commander-in-Chief Fleet in June after the Camp David meeting that we would be invading Iraq with America in the beginning of the following year. It was quite clear the government, we were thinking we have to get Parliament and others on side. So decisions already been made out of sight of the British public, but they already knew they then had to do some form of propaganda job in order to get the British public on side. So let's just follow it through a bit more. But what was interesting was that as it developed, there was all this stuff on weapons of mass destruction and everything. And it did seem to me that people were looking for a casus belli that they could discuss in Parliament. This language, Mike, is just incredible. This stuff, in order to have an excuse to get the war, which had been planned behind closed doors, it mirrors what we're seeing with the European Union, except we haven't got a direct war going on in Europe at the moment, but all done behind closed doors. And he highlighted this bit. He highlighted how from then on it's been assumed Parliament would be consulted before the use of military force, adding how that before the Iraq war that hadn't been the case. So he's a bit concerned that there should be sort of discussion, although he talks about the use of stuff in order to get across the idea to the British public that we could invade Iraq. He went on to say this: I think there are lots of circumstances where that is a real problem if it happens. Letting the public know by open debate is a real problem. We have now got this hybrid warfare. It's clearly not appropriate, I don't believe, for nuclear response. The whole issue of cyber, where speed is very much of the essence, and yet a really major impact can be caused, whole raft of issues that make it not necessarily the best thing to happen. So you can plot behind closed doors, create a war. You don't want the public to know. And now the new excuse is that we've got this hybrid warfare thing. Now, another man who was reported in the article, former head of the RAF, and here he is, Glenn Torpey. He said that having an open and transparent debate, it hands a degree of initiative to your potential adversary. It also exposes the thinking as well as weaknesses, adding that most adversaries are not constrained by normal behaviour or the boundaries of a, quote, transparent and free press like Western democracies. We do need to be very careful about that debate leading us to being at a greater disadvantage than we would already be at. To which I say, we've got a gap here, Mike. Either these men are mad, and of course I'm not qualified to say that, or we've got massive cognitive dissonance. So we've got Alan West effectively acknowledging the government lied over weapons of mass destruction to create a war and achieve regime change in Iraq. They were not held to account, but that's okay, as we might need the same policy to defend against hybrid warfare that the same unaccountable government says we should fear. And if we bring in the other learned gentleman, we've got having open and transparent debate over your plans to lie to create war and regime change, which would benefit the shareholders of BAE Systems. Why do I say that? Because this man was an advisor to BAE Systems for about 8 years, 9 years, helps the potential adversary. Adversaries are not constrained by normal behaviour and the boundaries of a transparent free press. This is utter nonsense. But what are they saying? That we can have members of the government plotting a war and then they simply execute it and they haven't got to answer to anybody. So I think we've got a government of occupation. I agree with this term. The government considers Westminster, the Parliament, Westminster Parliament sovereign, which is completely untrue, of course. The government is in fact run by the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is secretive and unaccountable. The Cabinet Office collaborates with big money, big business, including the arms industry. And the Cabinet Office requires now full autonomy to plan, execute and profit from any future war or conflict it sees fit to create.
Absolutely. Now, the Cabinet Office collaborates with big money, big business, including arms industry. Well, and to be using the term free press in the same breath, let's come on to our favourite Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, who's written an article for the mainstream press about Yemen. Now I've labelled this £200 million, the price of doing business. We'll come on to why that is in a second. Well, let's see what he had to say. Nothing in Yemen has been left untouched by war, not even the presidential palace in Aden. When I visited this fortified building a few weeks ago, you could see the pockmarks from bullets and the damage from explosions. I went to Aden to meet Yemen's recognised government and see for myself the realities of a grave humanitarian crisis. He said that on this anniversary of the intervention in Yemen's conflict led by Saudi Arabia, the imperative need for a peaceful settlement has never been greater. Now, he then went on to say that historical accuracy matters. He said this war did not begin with a Saudi-led intervention. 6 months later, in September 2014, Houthi rebels, representing no more than 15% of the population, captured most of the capital, Sana'a, and expelled the internationally recognised government. Saudi Arabia and its allies began their operation in March 2015 in order to restore that government, consistent with United Nations Resolution 2216. Before they had launched a single airstrike, Yemen was already at war. So, Vanessa, I'm just interested in your thoughts, first of all, on the issue of him meeting Yemen's recognised government in Aden, and secondly, on the suggestion by Jeremy Hunt that what he wrote in the following paragraph was in any way historically accurate.
I don't even know where to start with this idiot, honestly. Okay, let's start with the internationally recognised government. Mansour Hadi had overrun his GCC mandate, which was already questionable, by 1 year. He had failed to comply with the directives of that mandate, which was to call for an election and a referendum. He actually resigned twice in February 2015. So it is completely erroneous to describe this as the recognised government in Yemen. Jamal Ben Omar, the UN peace envoy at the time, said there was absolutely no need for the Saudi aggression to happen, which of course was endorsed by Obama at the time, because Yemenis were reaching a peaceful political resolution that included representation of all political parties inside Yemen. So Jeremy Hunt, as all people involved in supplying weaponry to the genocidal Saudi coalition, is lying through his teeth. This is a British recolonisation project of Aden, which of course they relinquished in '67 after the Yemenis again rose up against them. To describe this uprising and this resistance against a US coalition, UK-led recolonisation and ethnic cleansing in Yemen, which of course is pouring profits, exponential profits, into British aerospace. And again, we see the connection with Cabinet because of course Philip May's husband, has direct links to British aerospace and to their continued profitability via the Yemeni war. So I mean, I can't even start to pick out the level of hypocrisy every time this man speaks, including when he was in Aden. Houthis do not represent 15% of the population. The movement of Ansarullah represents the majority of the population inside Yemen. And to dismiss it as such, and to dismiss the fact that there is an existing constitutionally recognized government in Yemen that represents 38 of the political parties inside Yemen right now. It's criminal. It's absolutely criminal what the British government is doing to Yemen. And we need to really start talking about the legal implications of this, because both the UN, the British government, and the US government are absolutely, again, as they did in Iraq, they are effectively ethnically cleansing the population of Yemen of any resistance to the Saudi hegemony there, which of course then is basically another proxy occupation by the US and the UK in particular. There are gas reserves in the Red Sea. That's why Britain wants to be back in Aden. And of course, they're pushing for the secessionist movement in Aden to enable them to come back in.
As I said, I did label this £200 million, the price of doing business. So what's that about? Well, he said that, look, when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he was taking the drug dealer approach. He was saying if we didn't sell arms to the Saudis would just go somewhere else. Jeremy Hunt, well, was it a step forward? I don't think so. But anyway, his position is more, if we didn't sell Saudis our arms, we wouldn't have any influence with Saudi Arabia, and the situation would be 100 times worse. And in fact, he said it would be morally bankrupt. I'm not sure that he's qualified to know what moral bankruptcy is, Brian.
Not sure.
I think I was being slightly sarcastic there. But anyway, look, the other thing that you brought up was this issue of a free press. And so we'll just mention the fact that the EU decided to pass the directive on copyright yesterday for the digital single market. Two aspects of this. Article 11 of particular concern, Article 11, this is the link tax. And this, of course, means that the traditional media, the corporate mainstream media, will be entitled to charge other organizations if they want to link to or take snippets of content from articles that are on mainstream media. Now, this, of course, is targeting, they say, the likes of Google News, but in fact, it's actually targeting all the sort of alternative media news aggregation sites that have been around for a very long time and continue to provide a very useful service. They're not really breaking copyright. They're using fair use and fair dealing to put little snippets of content from the originating website on their own websites. The other aspect of this, of course, Article 13, which is the upload filter. This is like YouTube's Content ID on steroids. This has passed the European Parliament now. Somehow the big internet platforms are going to have to implement it, but of course it's not just about music or video, it's about all content. So this is further regulation, further restriction of freedom of speech on the internet. Yes.
I was just going to say, because ultimately they want total control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Vanessa, let's come back to Syria in a way. But you told me yesterday that there are moves afoot to attempt to prosecute President Assad at the International Criminal Court. Give us the background to this.
Well, basically, I think what's happening, there are two law firms and two leading lawyers that are taking cases out against President Assad for human rights abuses. The difficulty in the past for them has been basically that Syria is a non-signatory to the ICC, but a recent precedent set by the prosecution of the Myanmar government based on testimony from Rohingya refugees that had fled to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh, of course, is a signatory to the ICC. What they're now trying to do is to use the testimony of, I think it's 28 refugees who have fled to Jordan. Jordan is a signatory of the ICC, So they're trying to use the precedent of Myanmar to push this case forward. Now, the leading case, as you've put up there, is being submitted by a lawyer called Rodney Dixon, who, no surprise, represents Qatar against Saudi Arabia. He has previously declared an interest in taking the Syrian government to court for alleged human rights abuses based on, of course, the infamous Caesar report, which was effectively debunked by activist and journalist Rick Sterling. But even Human Rights Watch had to admit that the majority of the photos were actually of Syrian Arab army soldiers who'd been tortured by the terrorist groups inside Syria. The other group, as you've just put up, is Guernica Chambers, headed up by lovely individual, Toby Cadman, who's also submitted an Article 15 communication to the ICC. Now, Cadman is an interesting character. He's on the board of an organisation called Doctors Under Fire, whose other directors include Hamish de Bretton Gordon, the UK wheel-out chemical weapons expert who decided that fridges were dangerous at the last attempt to put any credible information forward. But he's obviously been instrumental in the production of the chemical weapons narratives that's been used to criminalise the Syrian government. But other directors are Dr. David Knott, who has been infamously reporting from terrorist-held areas where he's been operating on, among others, ISIS fighters. And then Dr. Saleha Hassan, who took part in the BBC Panorama Saving Syria's Children, of course, that has been forensically discredited and proven to be a hoax by Robert Stewart, a friend of ours and an excellent independent researcher. So this gives some indication as to the background. And bear in mind, of course, the Caesar report was also funded and commissioned by Qatar. So this is clearly an effort being led by, we believe, the UK, Turkey and Qatar to benefit, if you like, from the post-war dissonance in Syria, which is a very typical vacuum into which economic pressure, political pressure and international pressure can be brought. And the plan is probably to try to isolate President Assad, members of his government, at a time when obviously there needs to be potential for a peaceful political resolution. So it's basically an attempt to further pursue President Assad, to further isolate him internationally and even domestically, and to prevent any internal resolution. And of course, we've seen this before. We've seen it with the witch hunt of Milosevic. We've seen it with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and now we're seeing it again in Venezuela. You know, the imperialists do not give up. The war is to a large degree won militarily inside Syria, and they know that, but they're not going to give up. And so I think this is just the next step in their campaign to destabilize Syria, to prevent a peaceful resolution, to weaken President Assad's position with potential elections also coming up inside Syria. So it's to be expected, and I think what we're now waiting on, of course, is the response from Fatou Bensouda, who's the current Prosecutor General. The one weak point is that they are reliant on consent from Jordan to enable the case to go forward. So were Jordan, who has been improving relations with Syria with the opening of the trade borders, etc., and there are a number of members of the current Jordanian government who are pro-Syria, this is a potential weak link in their construct, let's say.
Okay, well, Vanessa, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's truly shocking, isn't it, when we see the state of our own country. The hypocrisy is just breathtaking. Just encourage people to get onto the UK Column website. I've put essential reading. All of this constitutional stuff is very, very important. People can read, hopefully learn from it, but of course that gives you the wherewithal to take on your MPs and ask them the difficult questions. And I believe it would make a massive difference if each MP was being bombarded with questions about the Constitution and criminality in Westminster on a daily, hopefully hour by hour basis.
Yes. Now, a few notices here. Tonight in Newcastle upon Tyne at the Royal Station Hotel is a 5G event. Mark Steele will be speaking at that, John Kitson and also Ian R. Crane. So that starts at 7:30 p.m. Tomorrow in Newcastle Crown Court, Mark Steele has an appeal hearing. This is over the allegation of harassment for asking Gateshead councillors questions about 5G. Also tomorrow, Lynn Thayer, if you remember, Lynn Thayer is David Noakes' colleague who was part of the GC MAF production team, is in the Strand for the second part of her extradition hearing on a European arrest warrant. And this is France attempting to get her extradited to France to face charges of distributing an unlicensed medicine. Of course, she wasn't distributing an unlicensed medicine. But anyway, that's the Strand tomorrow, 10 a.m. And we'd like to encourage anybody that could possibly go to either of those court cases to get along to them. Ian Crane will be at Lynn's hearing. And then on Friday in Cardigan in Wales, another 5G event, and details on screen there. Do get along to that one if you possibly can. And just finally then, just as a reminder that if you like what the UK Column does and would like to support us, then we would be very keen to see you join the UK Column community. You can do that by heading over to ukcolumn.org/community.
Okay, well, if the government can create its own wars overseas behind closed doors, of course, and we wouldn't want the public involved, we've been warning about the UK government and others taking our children. We've talked about the named person scheme in Scotland, but let's bring in Wales because this is the headline. Wales takes the next step to end the physical punishment of children. And although most people would have a dialogue about this, what is really going on here is that the state is saying, we don't really care what parents think. We are going to tell you how to bring up your children. But this was one of the key passages in this bill. The bill will do this by abolishing the common law defence of reasonable punishment so that any adult acting in a parental capacity cannot use it as a defence if accused of assault and battery against a child, meaning they can no longer legally, physically punish a child. So fascinating, Mike, to see that what's coming in here is not only taking away parents' rights to bring their children up as they see fit, but now we've got an attack on common law, and I don't think this is accidental. Now, where has all this come from? Well, one place we need to go is this lady, Sally Holland, and she's the Children's Commissioner in Wales. I wasn't able to do a little bit more research into what that term actually means, so I'm going to encourage people to have a look. I don't like the term, though, Children's Commissioner. She said this: there's nothing reasonable about physically punishing a child. This bill sends a clear signal that Wales is a country which protects children, a country which will afford children equal protection from physical punishment as adults, a country which promotes children's rights. This positive development is about removing a legal loophole to reflect what the vast majority of us parents believe, that physically punishing a child is no longer acceptable anywhere. In fact, this is all based on the UN's rules about how children should be brought up. That's where it's come from, the United Nations. Let's have a look at this little film clip which explains a bit more about her role.
The principal aim of the Children's Commissioner is to safeguard and promote children's rights. The Commissioner works for every child and young person in Wales up to the age of 18, up to 21 if a young person has been in care, or up to 25 if a young person has been in care and is still in education. The Commissioner can review how the decisions and practices of certain public bodies in Wales, including Welsh Government, affect children and young people in Wales and impact their rights under the UNCRC.
Well, there we are. Of course, the declaration that this is policy coming straight into UK from the United Nations. Interesting, we're back in international law. It doesn't matter about common law and the Constitution of UK. In is coming this international law, and it's coming in through this lady, Sue Holland. Now, if we have a little look into her, this is one of the things of interest, that previously she set up Cascade, Children's Social Care Research and Development Centre. This was all done with Cardiff University, Cascade's aim is to improve the well-being, safety and rights of children and their families. We're concerned with all aspects of community responses to social need in children and families, including family support services, children in need services, child protection, looked after children and adoption. Now, we know perfectly well, of course, that Wales, is not protecting children. We have too many cases where it's obvious that Wales has covered up. There's been a blind eye to the abuse of children, and yet this lady is claiming that Wales is going to be one of the leading countries in the world for protecting children. But if I just add into that slide, these are the academics linked to Cascade, and these are simply Cardiff University academics. So behind closed doors, a group of academics seem to have got together, and they are now going to tell parents how to bring their children up, and they're going to remove common law in the process. This is the original act, I believe, that set up the idea of the Children's Commissioner. So people can go and have a look at the Care Standards Act 2000. But just remarkable, Mike, we go back, we've devolution, splitting up the UK, bringing in the UN policy, getting rid of the Constitution, getting rid of common law. But what's the target? The children. And I think I'm right in saying that it was a Hitler quote, that he didn't mind what the parents got up to. He'd already got the children, and that was the future. I sense something similar here. And on the subject of who is standing up to really talk about the abuse of children and what should be done, I'm pleased to say that we've got John Wedger here, who did his own little interview of Wilfred Wong. It's on YouTube, it's exceptionally good, and I think it's already ruffled a few feathers, because I think it's been taken down once. So if you'd like to have a little look at that, it's a very good interview talking about what is really happening. And I'll just add that surprisingly, ICSA, the Child Abuse Inquiry, has now decided it will give John Wedger the opportunity to speak. And this appears to have come about because John was able to talk to one of the legal teams representing abuse survivors, who that legal team was astonished at the information he was bringing forward. And they've obviously put ICSA under pressure. But there we are, north of the border, no to named persons. Named persons. We've got the Scottish state attempting to get control of children. Now it's happening in Wales. I think the same thing is going to happen here fairly shortly, Mike.
Yeah. Okay. We'll leave it there.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Vanessa, thank you. We will be back at the same time on Friday.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.